The last thing I want to cover for today is the Pew Survey. So in 2013, the Pew Institute, which does all different kinds of research, especially surveys and sociological research, conducted this survey about Jewish Americans. There were between 5 and 6,000 people who were respondents in the survey, which is a huge number of people to include in a survey and to be able to use as thinking of showing some kinds of trends that are important in Jewish life in the United States right now. So one person asked whether or not 2013 is already obsolete. I think that's good thinking to consider how when research is conducted is relevant. I think that 7 years probably seems different depending on um, your age, for one thing. That I think basically that it still can show us something about trends, but that 7 years is either a long time or a short time, depending on kind of how zoomed in or zoomed out that we might be. So I think it's still really useful, even if we might want to ask more questions. And again, to ask, how would this have changed even since the survey? How would a new generation of adults begin to answer these questions? Because you yourself, for example, were not adults when this survey was conducted, and now you could totally be respondents. So I hear that at the same time that I want to say it's showing us kind of sweeping things, trajectories, and so of course it could be the case that the trajectories could change. So with that in mind about the Pew Survey, I want to look at just a couple of screens from the document that I gave you. So in the larger survey, there's much more information than what you see here. I just went ahead and only gave you the charts to make it easier and cut down what you needed to wade through. I can post the link for the full survey. One of the things that everybody from the class pointed to as most surprising to them was the increase in number of people who said that they were Jews of no religion. So I just want to say, as a class, people were surprised by that. I think clearly we can see a trajectory. But one thing that I want to add is that how people might define themselves as being a Jew of no religion might be different from how we as scholars would look at the patterns and rituals in their life and decide whether or not we want to see what they do as counting as religion. And so an important aspect of the study of religion is always the difference between the perceptions of the people we're studying and then our perceptions as scholars. So if we keep scrolling through this, I want to stop on the very last page just to point to a couple of things. So one is that to me, and I think, you know, having heard from a lot of people, I've heard people point to all of the different charts and graphs as showing something really important. To me, I think some of the most important information that we can see from this study comes on this last page in the graphs on what does it mean to be Jewish and what is compatible with being Jewish. Okay, so these are questions. The first one, I think, would be a question that people in answering it might think about themselves as well as others, their own values, their own definition of what it is to be Jewish. And I think what's really, really important, maybe the single most important thing we could take away from this survey is that there's no one thing that all Jews in the United States can agree on as being related to Jewishness or the single practice of Jewishness or the right way to practice, okay? So for this chart, we have what does it mean to be Jewish? We can see that the number one point is remembering the Holocaust. As many of you pointed out, what can sociological data tell us and what can it not tell us? it can't tell us what people think it means to remember the Holocaust, how that relates to their politics, their conceptions of Jews and others, whether this means that they simply remember those who died, or if it has a certain kind of lesson to their life today. All of that, that's what more interpretive scholarly work would need to do additional research for, right? Instead, this can show us a big trend. How do people answer? We see then that the next two largest answers are leading an ethical or moral life and working for justice or equality. Okay, so those are values that we might find in a lot of different ethnicities, nationalities, religions, races, ideologies, all different kinds of things. But here we see that subjectively, they're understood to be an important part of what it means to be Jewish. That being Jewish comes with a set of ethical aspirations or requirements for many people, at least conceptually. Exactly what those ethics are, how they live them, where they see the most important questions of justice, those again are the things that specific studies would have to fill in. This is thinking instead about something big, but I think this is an important point that for a lot of different traditions, there's a kind of looking outward, thinking about not just how to relate to members of the community, but both an individual and then a connected sense of ethics and justice. But this could be practiced Jewishly. It might be related to halakha, it might not, right? So I think, again, we can even think about how we could connect that to the two different readings from the Pittsburgh platform versus Hirsch. You see at the bottom of the list things like being part of a Jewish community, observing Jewish law, eating traditional Jewish foods, right? I think it's important that it says traditional Jewish foods and not kashrut, right? So this isn't about halakha, but an imagination of tradition. Even that the question is on here and 14% said yes, I think is important for saying how do people practice Jewishness, if not necessarily Judaism. On the other hand, it's pretty low, right? It's not essential to how a majority of Jews would define Jewishness, perhaps. We see that halakha is pretty low, right? Observing Jewish law, we can't know how respondents interpreted what observing means. Does it mean a little bit? Certain practices, trying to keep all of halakha, those kinds of things, right? That again, this sense that we just can get the bigger questions. And then I think what is compatible with being Jewish is a big question, and one that is really rooted in the context of American pluralism. That this question would really potentially be answered differently in many different times and places. I think it's incredible that 34% of people would say that it's compatible to be Jewish and to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. If historically Jews and Christians have really defined their own sense of self and social identity against each other, they have competed to define the correct interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, either as the Jewish covenant or as something superseded by the covenant in Christ, depending on, of course, being Jewish or Christian. Those are things that have really, really been seen as mutually exclusive. And so I think in this context of American pluralism, these questions allow a sort of response of people to say that the boundaries are shifting. Or at least that's how I read this, okay, that I don't have data for earlier ways that people would have responded to this. But now we do have this survey, and I think there will be future surveys that will allow us to continue to follow the trends. But it was really important to start somewhere in conducting this survey. A lot of people sort of ask questions about the issue of Israel. So first of all, I think that we should see this as just interrogating what is the actual understanding of the importance of Israel in general. Also, what is the importance? What does that mean? Right, that we see on the what does it mean to be Jewish, that there's a question about caring about Israel. Caring means something that is very, very broad, right? But less than half of Jews in the United States would answer that way, okay? So I think we can't make essentializing assumptions that connect Jews and Israel. Some Jews are really highly invested in it. Other Jews just really aren't, or they don't think that it's an essential part of being Jewish, even if they think it's one way to be Jewish. Then these other questions about attachment and attitudes about Israel, these are simply ways, I think, of gauging how have people interacted with Israel, the place, not to mention Israelis, the people, right, who are many and plural, just as Jewish Americans are. A whole different survey would have to be conducted. People said, maybe that would be really interesting. I'm sure it would be. But a different institute would have to do it. This particular survey was conducted by the Pew Institute, but a lot of Jewish studies scholars, including a lot of sociologists, but also people from all different kinds of backgrounds, participated in helping design the questions to reflect things that already seem to be in the air, kind of ideas that people have about Jews, ideas that Jews have about themselves, and then really seeing how does that kind of shake out in terms of the way that people would answer pretty simple questions, and seeing whether the category of how people understand themselves as Jewish affects the way that they see those things, right? So I do think we see some small difference, but for the most part, I think it really depends on the question. So I don't think that these questions need to be interpreted as being pro-Israel or anti-Israel, as just kind of a concluding point, but rather as attempting to be neutral and just simply trying to understand how Jewish Americans understand what their relationship to Israel is.